Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just as a reminder, we are in webinar mode, so that means that we can't see or hear any of you guys on the Zoom call. So if you would like to get a message to us, feel free to come through the chat. I'm also going to ask that if there are any questions that you would like to ask of myself or of our panelist, John Harris, please put them in the chat. So officially, welcome everyone. My name is Rene Cantu. I am the current chair of the GLBX Council of the Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce. I also work for Equality Florida, doing all of our business outreach, and we are excited that we are able to kind of partner between Equality Florida and the Chamber to put this Lunch and Learn together. We are going to be talking today about the legislative session that is currently underway in Tallahassee. Every year, Equality Florida watches closely what happens at the level of state government to make sure that we are represented and that we know what's going on when it comes to laws that are being passed by our senators and our representatives that will affect the LGBT community. So we've invited one of my colleagues, John Harris Maurer, who is sort of our watchdog at the Capitol. And I'm going to have him just kind of do a quick introduction, and then just we'll start the discussion. So I turn over the microphone to John Harris.
All righty, thanks, Rene. As Rene mentioned, my name is John Harris Maurer, originally a born and bred Fort Lauderdale native, so nice to be home, at least virtually, for the afternoon. Now based full-time up here in Tallahassee as the public policy director for Equality Florida, which basically means I'm Equality Florida's lobbyist in the Capitol and also help with local policy work outside of session around the state. And of course, it's another great place where Fort Lauderdale and Broward County are leading on the local level. This is now going into my fourth session with Equality Florida. Have a good amount of experience with prior work in the Florida legislature and Texas legislatures. And we're shaping up for yet another exciting, a bit of an unusual year with a pandemic, but excited to get into it. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. If I can figure that out. All right. So just briefly here, a little bit of schoolhouse rock on how a bill becomes a law, and just some general sense of following the 2020 elections, where we are as far as the legislative makeup. So we're very excited that LGBTQ issues are growing in public acceptance. It is no longer just a straight bipartisan issue, but the state legislature is still a tough environment for us. Certainly less receptive than we have in South Florida. So it is a lot of work. We end up doing a lot of defensive work, first and foremost, to make sure that the LGBTQ community is protected, and oftentimes that where we have great local protections like Fort Lauderdale, those measures aren't being put at jeopardy by what they're doing at the state level. So we are coming into a moment, as folks know, where we also have really strong dynamics at play based on what's happening federally and how that's trickling down to the state level. So we obviously have the election of President Joe Biden and a series of executive actions that he has taken, including those that are supportive of the LGBTQ community. We also, just last week, saw the passage through the federal House of Representatives for the Equality Act. Really great developments, and also that, along with the Bostock ruling from the Supreme Court last summer, I think are leading to a pushback that we're seeing at the state level. We know that these sort of dynamics often do function as a pendulum, so because of those pressures federally, we are seeing some more anti-LGBTQ bills at the state level. So another really important development that I just want to touch on before we jump into specific legislation is some great news that we had last month from the Florida Commission on Human Relations. And this does also, again, relate back to what happened at the federal level with the Bostock ruling that folks may be familiar with from the US Supreme Court over the summer. And that was the case where you had an opinion by conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch that said where there are existing protections on the basis of sex in civil rights law, that includes protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Basically, you can't discriminate against somebody on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity without taking into account their sex. So that was a real watershed victory, really exciting, and something that Equality Florida worked with the Florida Commission on Human Relations with for a number of months to make sure that that was similarly being implemented at the state level. The Florida Commission on Human Relations is the Florida agency that handles those sort of non-discrimination protections when you think about our sort of traditional areas for non-discrimination like employment, housing, and public spaces or public accommodations. So we actually have a champion on the commission. I believe she's the Broward County Deputy Director, but she helped really clarify from the commission, Monica Sapero, that they would be, again, extending that same interpretation that we saw at the federal level at the state level. So the Florida Commission on Human Relations made clear that where Florida law already says there are non-discrimination protections on the basis of sex, that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. That is huge for us because it's something that we've been working on legislatively in the Capitol for years. So really excited about that development, again, sort of understanding the extension of the Supreme Court case to Florida law. So we're very excited about the development. And we know that, again, as I mentioned before, often our opponents on LGBTQ equality will see that and push back. So for Equality Florida's posture, we are positioning to defend that win and also working on public education so that we can make sure that folks know these protections are now available. So that may be things like required flyers that you have to put up in a break room that talk about workers' comp or other, protections, opportunities there are, that those reflect these changes so that folks now know about this development. It doesn't do any good if it's just on a piece of paper on somebody's desk at the Florida Commission on Human Relations. We are going to be working to make sure that, again, folks know those protections are there. So really exciting context for us walking into legislative session. But really the top of our slate for Equality Florida is going to be defending against a slew of bad bills that we've seen, particularly around transgender issues. So the first two bullet points you see here capture that. The first bill is an anti-trans youth bill. That's House Bill 935, filed by Representative Anthony Sabatini. This is in some ways a repetition of a bill that we saw from him last year. That was a trans youth medical care ban. It essentially would imprison doctors for up to a year for providing best practice medical care to trans youth. So we're certainly opposed to this legislation that really puts the government between trans youth and their decisions and conversations with their families and their doctors. And it's something that we have seen around the country. And unfortunately, Representative Sabatini has sort of mashed that up for this session with a ban on trans youth participation in sports. So the second half of that bill is really what we see in those two trans sports ban bills, House Bill 1475 by Representative Kaylee Tuck and Senate Bill 2012 by Senator Kelly Stargel. And we know that the trans community is one that is very misunderstood. And for folks who don't have, personal experience there, they may struggle to understand why these sports bans are so problematic for the trans community. But it really comes down to the fact that participation in sports is so important for everyone's development. You know, when we think about how you build teamwork, self-reliance, leadership skills, for many young people, that comes through participation in team sports. And we know that those are critical life lessons. So we want our trans youth from the K to 20 level to still have all of those opportunities available to them. So that's another bill that we're very much following and expect to see as a major priority this session. It has been introduced in, at last count, I think 23 other states around the country. So we know that this is a real issue, and it has also been introduced federally. So something that we're working hard to educate lawmakers and help them understand the perspective of these trans young folks who are being denied an opportunity to participate in sports, be a part of a team, and benefit from all those developmental experiences that comes from those sort of opportunities. That said, it is not all bad news on the trans front. We also have the hate crimes law expansion bill, which is House Bill 43, Senate Bill 194 by Representative Joe Geller and Senator Lori Berman, both from South Florida. So this is a bill that we are supporting. It would modify Florida's existing hate crimes statute to ensure that when we look at what bases for hate crimes are, that includes crimes of prejudice based on gender, gender identity, and a wider version or a wider definition of disability. So there's already a very narrow application for disability, but we're trying to bring it into alignment with the rest of the Florida Civil Rights Act and its understanding of how we define disability. So we know, unfortunately, that Florida has had an epidemic of anti-trans violence, particularly murders of Black trans women. So we think it's really critically important that we reflect that in our hate crimes law. Hate crimes are different from just any other sort of crime of opportunity or domestic violence. They are really about sending a message to an entire community based on the victim's identity. So that's why they are treated separately and why we think it's so important that gender identity, in addition to gender and the full range of disability, be reflected there. We are excited, actually, the Senate version has already moved through one committee and it had bipartisan support there. So great prospects there. It has not been heard yet in the Florida House, but we're hopeful to get some momentum on that. And I'll back up very briefly for a little more context on legislative session. You may know yesterday was the official first day of session. It starts this 60-day period for the lawmakers in Tallahassee to do all of their jobs here. Really the only thing they have to do before adjourning session is to pass a budget. But there are a lot more of these bills that we'll be seeing move through the process, even in the slowdown of a pandemic session. The lawmakers have actually already been up in Tallahassee for a number of weeks for what they call committee weeks, when they are filing legislation and hearing it and starting to move bills through the process. So that's why you have things like the hate crimes expansion law bill that has already been through one committee. The anti-trans youth bill and the trans sports ban bill both have not yet been heard in committee. A few other bills that we're really excited about or focusing on. The first two both deal with HIV issues. The first being a PrEP and PEP access bill. This is the first year it's been introduced. It's carried by Representative Nick Duran and Senator Ray Rodriguez. PrEP and PEP, for those who may not know, are medications that really allow folks to take personal responsibility for their sexual health and ultimately try to prevent transmission of HIV. So these bills would basically make those sort of medications available from a pharmacist in a limited supply. For PrEP, it's up to a 60-day supply of PrEP. PEP, it would be one regular course of PEP without a doctor's prescription. So again, improving access to these sort of medications is really helpful for ensuring that folks can take responsibility for their own health and ultimately protect public health as a whole. A key part of ending the HIV epidemic, which unfortunately we know is so pronounced in Florida in particular, and in South Florida in Broward and Miami-Dade counties. The second bill, also dealing with HIV issues and the stigma that we see around HIV, is the HIV modernization bill. This is legislation that has been introduced for several years now and has had some movement in the House and Senate. We are hoping to see it get over the finish line this year. It is being carried by Representative Felicia Robinson, a new freshman this year, and Senator Jason Pizzo. And this bill is really about bringing Florida's HIV laws into alignment with modern science and technology around prevention and treatment for HIV. Our HIV criminalization laws were written in the 80s at the height of the epidemic and haven't been updated since. So what we want is for HIV to be treated similarly to other STDs and STIs, recognizing that it is a chronically manageable condition. Now, for most people living with HIV, they're on a 1 pill a day regimen and have virtually the same lifespan as those who are not living with HIV. And our laws should reflect that and reflect the health risks when we look at these sort of criminalization penalties. One last bill I'll touch on that's gotten a lot of attention, not unique to the LGBTQ space, but that you might have heard something about, is the anti-protest bill. This was an idea originally shopped over the summer by Governor DeSantis in response to the racial justice protests that we saw in Florida and around the country, and really gained more attention after the insurrection at the Capitol, cracking down basically on public protest. We have concerns because we see it as an attempt to chill freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that are sort of critical constitutional rights for all of us, in the way that it enhances penalties and creates new criminal penalties for participating in protest. This is really key for the LGBTQ community because protest has frankly been in part of the DNA of the LGBTQ rights movement. We are very familiar with the fact that, when you don't have a seat at the table or are actively being denied a seat at the table, sometimes protest is the only way that a community has to make itself be heard. So that has already seen some movement in the House. It is attracting a lot of attention, and we'll see where that goes because there are a lot of groups, again, that have raised very serious concerns, bipartisan groups, defense and prosecution side. So I'm sure not the last that you'll hear about that. And then just for your awareness, again, there are probably between 80 and 100 bills that Equality Florida is tracking at the moment. So far more than I will try to run through with y'all here. I know it's a lot of information, but this is just kind of giving you an idea of some of our top line issues. I'd be happy to talk about them more. I know we'll have an opportunity to get into some question and answer on these bills or other bills that you may be hearing about. But also worth noting, we do have a number of exciting new bills. One of them is the PrEP and PEP access bill that I already mentioned, again, new this year for the first time. There's also a bill to add non-binary gender markers on driver's licenses and other government IDs. Florida does not provide for that now. There are a few states that have adopted that. It always blows my mind. I think Arkansas has had a non-binary gender marker option for a decade at this point. So if Arkansas can do it, I think Florida can do it. And a final bill around banning the gay and trans panic defense. If you're not familiar with this, it is a legal defense that people bring up that essentially shifts the blame to an LGBTQ victim for experiencing violent crime. Basically, the perpetrator of crime can say that they were so panicked or sort of incensed when they found out that somebody was LGBTQ that they had a diminished capacity that should make them less culpable for violent action following that. The American Bar Association is pushing to eliminate this in all 50 states. There are already 11 states and Washington, D.C. that have banned the practice. So we're excited to see Senator Lauren Book carrying that, along with Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, who is one of our out members of the LGBTQ caucus in the legislature. So lots of top line concerns, like I said, particularly around trans issues, but also some exciting possibilities with our new bills. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that if you are interested in talking about these issues with your lawmakers, we do have Equality Florida Lobby Days going on right now. And you have a special opportunity to participate this year. Typically, our Lobby Days event is a 2-day program in the Capitol with folks traveling from around the state to be in Tallahassee and meet face-to-face with their lawmakers. This year, again, because of all the COVID protocols, that is not possible. So we've shifted to an all virtual approach, and we've broken it down by region of the state. So our Southeast Florida region meetings will be coming up on March 15th and 17th. You can see the counties, including Broward, listed there, as well as a link for our website, or I'll put my email address in the chat. We would love to have you participate. The meetings with lawmakers are usually 15, maybe up to 30 minutes. And the most important thing is telling your story, putting a face to these issues. Nobody expects you to walk in being a constitutional law expert, having memorized the lines of the bill. So it is very easy for anybody to walk into the process and join. And it's incredibly important to hear those stories. So, your perspectives in trying to attract and retain top talent. If the lack of LGBTQ protections is a hindrance there, that's always critical to hear about. Or the experiences of your LGBTQ employees or your own experiences really do make a difference. They put a face to these issues so that it's not just paper that we're pushing around, but really helping to show that these issues impact folks' lives, whether it's your life, somebody you know or care about. We'd love to have you join. So with that, I will hand the mic back to Rene.
So John Harris, somebody was asking about the number 40 in your first slide. If the slide said there were 40 senators, is that 40 senators who support our cause, or out of the 100 senators?
My apologies. So we're talking, sorry, I've been focusing really on the state level. So state level, we have 120 representatives and 40 senators. The 100 senators is obviously the federal level, where we have our 2 Florida senators, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, who will also hopefully have a chance to vote on the Equality Act, since it has now passed the US House and will be moving over to the Senate.
Okay, and just for those of you that are interested in seeing the complete slate that Equality Florida is sort of monitoring, I put the link in the chat, as well as I put an actual link for the lobby days if any of you want to participate in that. And also something that I meant to mention in the beginning, as it relates to the Chamber of Commerce. This Chamber of Commerce, mainstream Chamber of Commerce, is one of, if not the only, mainstream Chamber of Commerce in the country that has divided or that has dedicated a full council or a part of the structure of the organization to the LGBT community, which I think is phenomenal. And so because of that, earlier in the year, or last year, the Governmental Affairs Committee decided to endorse what would have been the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, which is the statute that the law that we've been pushing for I guess 11 years now, to change the civil rights statute for the state that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And with the decision that John Harris spoke about earlier, we are at a posture where we're not necessarily pushing for that to be introduced, but we are sort of monitoring what all the interpretations and how everything sort of falls into place with that as we move forward through the legislative session. So I think that's a great accomplishment for this chamber. So I think it's really important for us to continue to support the chamber. One thing that I was going to ask, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but John Harris, in the last few years, I've remember there have been bills introduced that were considered preemption bills. Could you explain what those are, and if let us know, are there any that are going to that you see might come up this year?
Sure. I'll say as a threshold matter, fortunately, we are not seeing a lot of bad preemption bills this year. It is an area that we saw huge issues with last session. So you might have heard us talk about the slate of 8 that included a number of these preemption bills. And preemption bills are essentially where the state government is declaring that there's an area of law that only the state should be able to regulate and city or county governments cannot take action in. You could also see the federal government preempting state regulation. But the sort of issues that we saw last session were around local regulation that could have impacted protections that exist in places like Fort Lauderdale. So things like protections against conversion therapy. Fort Lauderdale has, as does Broward County, an ordinance against this widely debunked, fraudulent, and even deadly practice that tries to, quote unquote, pray the gay away or change folks' sexual orientation and gender identity. We know it is incredibly harmful to minors. So those sort of protections say, if you are licensed by the state as a doctor or mental health therapist, counselor, then you have to be practicing good medicine. And every mainstream medical and mental health association has come out against conversion therapy. So the concern was that should the state say that only it can regulate in this area, there is no state law about conversion therapy. And it could displace or roll back those sort of local protections. Same with what we have around non-discrimination protections. Again, Fort Lauderdale, Broward County have great protections already on the books. But prior to this very recent development with the Florida Commission on Human Relations, 40% of the state didn't have those sort of protections. And again, if you had the state coming in saying that only at the state level may they regulate those sort of protections, it would have rolled back or eliminated those local protections. So yesterday, the first day of session, was the last day for bills to be introduced by a member. So it seems like we have dodged a bullet on that this year, but I will also say there are a couple other procedures, things to be introduced like as bills from an entire committee rather than a single member that aren't subject to that same deadline. There are amendments that get piled all the time. So we remain vigilant. Session is not over until they drop the ceremonial hanky at the end of session. A bit of an odd tradition, but it is. So we'll still be watching for those sort of preemption issues, but it does seem like at least in that field, we haven't seen as much this year. Unfortunately, in the alternative, we're seeing very direct attacks on things like the trans community. So that's sort of the position we find ourselves in at the moment. I do see in the chat, there's a question. I'll take the second one first. Is Florida in alignment with other states for local protections? Florida has actually been far ahead of the curve in adopting local protections. Again, 60% of Floridians live in a city or county that has those sort of protections. That is far above the, I think, any other state. Now, some other states also adopted statewide protections that Florida didn't have. So Florida has not been leading in terms of statewide protections. And I think that's one of these areas where you really see a disconnect between representation at the state level and what's happening locally. We do have very strong Republican control, much stronger than you might think looking at recent elections, particularly before 2020, when you had statewide races being decided by razor-thin margins that suggested the Florida electorate was much more evenly split, and yet very strong Republican control at the state level, and that goes to how our legislative districts are drawn. So I can talk a little bit more about that if there are other questions, but I also see the a question about Senators Scott and Rubio's records on LGBTQ issues. I will say right now, as folks I'm sure know, we have an evenly divided Senate. 50 members that caucus with the Democrats, 50 with the Republicans. And while we have a Democrat as the vice president who can cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, when we look at things like the Equality Act, what we know is you really need 60 votes for it to pass, not just 50, because there is the filibuster that basically gives any member an opportunity to prevent a bill from being heard. So unless you have 60 votes, then the bill can be filibustered and it just never comes up for a vote. Really looking at the sort of electoral map out there and the map of LGBTQ support in the 100-member Senate, one of the only ways that you can get to 60 is to pick up a support from either Rubio or Scott, potentially both of them. So Equality Florida and a number of our partners have had several meetings now, more than several, with their offices, trying to, again, do the same things that we're talking about in lobby days. Share those personal stories, talk about the bill, talk about their very real world implications and why they are so important. And I will say, so far, neither of them has committed to support it. So we're continuing to work on that, but I think it is an uphill push. We have some data points. Unfortunately, when now Senator Rick Scott was a governor, he had several opportunities to add LGBT non-discrimination to his executive orders for the state around non-discrimination and refused to do so. So we've seen some developments that are clearly at least missed opportunities for LGBTQ equality, and otherwise have not seen them signaling support. So we're continuing to do that work, and hearing from the business community is certainly incredibly impactful. If you all are willing to reach out, Equality Florida also has tools and some pre-written material that you can use to do that outreach to our senators.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say that here we are speaking to members of a Chamber of Commerce. So clearly we are business folks. We are involved in the business community. We are engaged, and aside from participating in a lobby days, you want to kind of mention maybe other ways that business people can get involved in these particular issues. And specifically how it might impact them as business people, either business owners or corporate folks.
Sure. I will say Equality Florida's lobby days is one example of sort of a vehicle for getting involved, but certainly not the only one. We do also have Pride at the Capitol coming up on March 10th. It is the first ever Pride at the Capitol. Very excited about it. Again, because of COVID protocols, it'll be an all virtual event. But I'm sure Rene can share more information on it. We'll have some virtual programming throughout the day for folks to tune into or watch on social media, coupled with particular actions. So some things on social media to reach out to lawmakers, a time to drive emails into the Capitol, and another opportunity to place calls directly to those members. Really taking the time to call a lawmaker's office about a priority, I think, is the most impactful. They really do understand that it is a whole nother level of commitment if you're willing to set aside that time to find their contact information and put in a call beyond just sort of clicking a button. Both are helpful. I don't want to dissuade folks from sending emails and other forms of outreach, but again, if you're interested in doing that outreach, or again, as business leaders, many of y'all are well connected. You may already have a relationship with Representative LaMarca. And so when you run into him at an event, you can talk about these priorities. It is great if you can talk about a specific bill, like naming the PrEP and PEP access bill or the anti-protest bill. But again, you don't have to be a legislative expert to get involved. Even if you're just saying, look, as a business owner, I'm hearing about concerns from my LGBTQ employees about discrimination that they're facing in finding housing, or that they're worried about whether they have access to medications that they want to protect their own sexual health. You can talk about issues and flag LGBTQ equality as an area of concern that helps those lawmakers know, okay, this is something that I should be paying attention to, even if you aren't coupling it with a bill number and bill title and legislative language. So anywhere that you can do that is helpful. We also often see folks who may want to do something in writing. Maybe you know, a virtual lobby visit isn't your thing, but if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed on something like, again, the need to update Florida's HIV laws, or the need to get rid of the gay and trans panic defense. Again, we can help you figure out the best way to go about that and make your voice heard in a different way. It can be that you name a lawmaker in those things, but you don't have to. Again, if you just want to speak to the importance of an issue, that can be another good way to convey that. Rene, I think you had another question that I didn't touch on.
No, that was it. But I do now have another question. Sure. You were talking about conversion therapy earlier, and I know that in the past there has been some bills introduced that would ban that statewide. Is there anything like that coming up this year?
There are two bills that have been introduced around conversion therapy. And this is, again, another great place that Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, and some other local governments have really been true leaders. There are 23 local governments around the state that have enacted protections against conversion therapy. One of the reasons that we've seen a slowdown on that is because of some of the litigation that's happening in federal courts around those protections. So there's a group that sued both the city of Boca Raton and Palm Beach County for their protections. Essentially, the local governments won in a preliminary finding, and the opponents then challenged that, took it to the 11th Circuit, which is one of the appellate courts that covers Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. That court went the opposite way. And so now the local governments, along with a number of partners, including ones like Equality Florida and folks that we've helped organize, are seeking what they call en banc review, which means basically a rehearing in front of all the judges of the 11th Circuit. So cases traditionally are just assigned to a 3-judge panel. That's what we got the ruling from. But we know that the ruling there is actually in direct contrast with 2 other circuit courts from other parts of the country that have upheld virtually the same protections. So we're waiting to see whether the court as a whole will reconsider that decision. So there are 2 bills on conversion therapy. They're actually different from last year's bills. We actually have some issues with the bills and think that they should be broader in scope. But at the moment, no movement on those bills yet.
Okay, are there any other questions from any of our attendees? If you would please put them in the chat. John Harris, do you have any other topics that you might want to kind of enlighten our group with?
I think that's about it. I'll note that, as I'm sure you all know well, there are a number of priorities for the business community, as always, moving in session. I think the biggest one, and it is one that I won't comment on much because I do not have expertise on the issue, is around COVID-19 liability for businesses. So I know that is a topic that is moving through the legislature and getting a lot of attention. But as always, I think probably this group, more than some of the day-to-day citizens that we talk to, appreciate just how important what's going on in Tallahassee is, even if it feels remote, even if it is a 7.5 hour drive away. I do hope that you're paying attention to these issues, certainly ones like the ones on Equality Florida's legislative slate that there's a link to in the chat. But whatever the issue is, making your voice heard is critically important in the process. And particularly this year, it is so much harder, I think, to break through because of the pandemic. The Capitol is virtually on lockdown. I mean, when I go to try to testify for the Senate, I actually have to go to the Civic Center in town and do virtual testimony, similar to the format that I'm using right now with y'all. that gets beamed into the Capitol several blocks away. And they actually have folks who are literally taking the appearance cards and running them several blocks from the Civic Center to the Senate, back and forth all day, to try to accommodate, social distancing and COVID protocols. In the House, I was in a committee yesterday with a room that would usually have 50 people in it, and there were literally only 3 of us in that room. So it is harder to make your voice heard, and to the extent you can, I think a lot of that noise has been filtered out this session. So I think it is resonating a lot more with lawmakers if you can get that time.
Awesome. Okay, well, I see no more questions, so I think we can finish our webinar a little early. As a reminder, if you are not currently a member of the Chamber of Commerce, we encourage you to look at becoming one. If you are interested and you need some information, you can reach out to Jenny DeBorgia, who works at the Chamber. She's actually on the list of attendees today, so she's at her desk. Call her. There is a special running now that you can talk to her about for joining, so I encourage you to ask about that. Otherwise, make sure you check the calendar of events on the Chamber website at ftlchamber.org or .com, and join us for our next event, which hopefully will be coming up in the next few months, in which we will be in person, hopefully. Thanks for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, John Harris.
Thank you all for tuning in.